was going to be talking about PB or not PB. How to get random slopes in international large-scale assessments.
Hey everyone, many thanks for being so late, enjoying the lunch. What I'm going to talk about is like how to deal with the research inquiry which you want to retrieve random slopes out of a large-scale assessment study, specifically when you have an outcome that is represented by a plausible pattern. So first, I'm just going to show you like the rationale of fitting or estimating fixed slope in comparison to random slopes. So when we do, for example, let's say a mixed model in which we have several schools and we have two attributes within the schools for the same observations, when we fit the fixed effects models, what we're mainly doing is assuming that we can represent the relationship between these two attributes with a single line. So this is, for example, let's say that we have an inquiry in which we say that males and females have a difference regarding their endorsement of self-efficacy, and we will have some sort of distance between the two. We will, with a fixed effects model, what we're doing is that we're assuming that that distance between the two attributes for each person is common across all the schools, or all the nests, or clusters. Random models or random slopes, what they're doing is that they're allowing you to estimate that that relationship between these two attributes could vary between the clusters. And this tends to be commonly used within research effectiveness in education, especially for two hypotheses. There's a text effect. So what I mentioned is that there are two main effects, two main research inquiries in which this kind of question is done. One of them is called the compensatory hypothesis. So this, you have the notion or idea that there might be some teacher practices that occurs between the schools that they may ameliorate the gap between, the socioeconomic gap, for example, across the population. So let's say that you have, in the case of political socialization, the idea that the larger the political discussion that occurs within the schools may produce smaller gaps between students that have parents with different levels of education. So the larger the discussion that occurs in the school, they ameliorate the population gap that you would expect over intergenerational differences on civic knowledge, for example. You can have more or less the same kind of questions regarding mathematics or whatever other outcome in education. So the main point is that you have the suspicion that there might be an attribute that may be correlated with this distance between these kind of observations. The other strand in research effectiveness is way much more general. It's just the idea that given a teacher practice or some sort of intervention within at the cluster level, that the reaction of the observations might be different. So, in both cases scenarios, one way to address these kind of questions is that you may need to estimate a random slopes. So that means that you need specific slopes for the presentation of the relationship between these two attributes. The issue is that, let's say that you're studying this out of a substantive inquiry. Large-scale assessment seems to be like a really ideal scenario to answer these kind of questions. Maybe because you're going to have, let's say, about 150 schools or classrooms, depending on the kind of design that you're using. So if, let's say that you're using studies from the IEA, that means that you, most likely scenario, you're going to have designs in which you have about 150 impact classrooms. So that means that all the students within a classroom. Whereas if you do the same thing with PISA designs, you need to account for the fact that in this case you might get students that come from different classrooms, but they are from the same school. Even though this is kind of like the best case scenario, so you have several schools that are maximizing the variance on the population of the students, there is a caveat. And that caveat is that the representation of the, let's say, principal attribute and the research interest of the study is going to be represented by an imputation model. So you're going to receive, let's say, 5 different plausible values. They're going to represent the attribute of interest. Either this be civic knowledge, mathematics, or something else. And the issue is that how can you get random slopes when you have different imputations? Or what are the kind of limitations that you should be wary about when you're going to do such a thing? So one thing to bear in mind is what are plausible values. Plausible values can be think of as an exercise of an imputation. So you have a response model, you have several conditional variables within this model, and you get random draws of the representation of this random term. And these random terms should be like a way to represent the proclivity of the students to give you correct answers or answers in whatever direction. One of the, let's say, limitations or characteristics that these kind of scores have is that the whatever thing that you want to retrieve out of them, it needs to be within a space. And that space is limited by the model that is being used to generate these scores. One term that in the literature is used to talk about that space is the idea of the congeniality. So let's say that you have only 3 effects. So it's 3 different fixes effects for being male or female, having parents with tertiary or non-tertiary education, and coming from, let's say, urban or rural schools. And let's say that you want to retrieve the interaction between one of these factors. If this is not represented or specified in the congenial model, that means that you may not retrieve that kind of effect when you're using the plausible values. The way that the different large-scale studies use the information that they have in the background questionnaires is a little bit more complex. What they do is that they just generate several different component principle, principal components, and they feed them in this conditional model. So the issue is that at least what you know is that the most likely scenario is that there is no representation of interactions, and if there is, it's a little bit uncertain. You don't know if there is an appropriate representation of interaction that you might be looking for. And we're certain for sure that there is no way to represent random intercepts out of the blue. So there are ways that people have come, let's say, to terms or to different kind of like techniques to try to represent within the plausible values the random intercepts, and they have tried to do the same thing with random slopes. But as far as I know, in the current literature, there is no solution to have a representation of the random slope. There is a solution at least to represent intercept slopes, random intercepts. So let's say that you want to retrieve a good estimates of an interclass correlation between schools, as long as they're using an appropriate conditional model to include that kind of variation in the plausible values, you could. So for example, in the case of ICCS, if you use data from 2009 and you use the plain plausible values they are released, these are not going to be really good tools to get information of the variability between the schools. The most likely scenario is these are going to be underestimated. That's not the case with how the plausible values were generated for the same study on 2016. So the main issue is that this is not a problem with the study itself, it's a problem specifically of how the plausible values are generated. And the issue is that if, let's say that you're using different kind of studies, you may have the choice to move between rounds if this is something that is sensitive to your research inquiry. So let's say, coming back again to ICCS, let's say that you have the choice to either use study the original one, so in 1999, or the 2009, or the 2016. So let's say that you want to represent variability between the school. It might be the case that the 2016 is a better tool for the kind of research inquiry that you may have. So the main point is that it's really important how the plausible values are generated, because these have limitations, and given the characteristic of the conditional model, they may distort or obstacle or limit the kind of questions that you can address. So this is kind of like something that you need to bear in mind when you're using this kind of scores. So let's say for the majority of the questions that one may have, plausible values are fine. But if you're in the specific niche of generating random slopes, then you're kind of like trouble. So I'm going to try to show you like how risky it is to rely on plausible values when you need random slopes. So what we're going to do is that we're just going to feed a disaggregated model. I'm going to do it with sex. So distinguishing between females and males over civic knowledge using ICCS 29. And I'm going to do the same thing with socioeconomic status. And we're going to do the same thing for 35 countries within the participating countries from ICCS 29. I'm using purposely 29 because I know that the conditional model that is used is one of the most simple ones. So this one, we know already that it's not necessarily prepared to generate between school variability, and it's also distorted to generate, for sure, random slope variability. And I'm excluding only 3 countries, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, and Malta, because they have too few schools given the implemented sample design. Sorry, there's something else there. So I'm going to do what the idea is that I'm going to have like a really simple model to generate random slopes. So we're going to do it first over the random, the plausible values, and as a comparison, I'm going to use the IRT weighted least estimates. So if you look through the available values that are in ICCS 29, you can find this like alternative representation of the ability of the test, which is the IRT weighted least estimates, and it's published. So you can just go and, I'm not re-estimating anything regarding the test. This is something that is already there. And given the literature, what we know is that if we have enough, like a good number of items that were used to generate these scores, and they have like a good spread and high reliability, the most likely scenario is that this score is going to be like a really good representation of the variability that we're looking for. So that means that we may not need to re-estimate everything over again from the ground up using the responses of the items. So we can just use the IRT scores that is there to make a fair comparison regarding the plausible values. And the expectation is that the plausible values should give me less information that in comparison to what can I get using the IRT scores, which again, this is going to go against the common recommendations that you would find when you want to use large-scale assessment, in which they would tell you you need to use the plausible values because this is the best representation of the ability that you may want to use. So this is kind of like a counterintuitive recommendation in which you may not need to use the plausible value for a specific kind of question. So if I show you, this is just like the correlation between the 2 methods. So I'm just getting the same random slope out of the plausible values and out of the IRT weighted least estimates. And here I'm just showing you for how many countries I can retrieve a random slope that has enough variability between the slopes. So these bubbles that are in blue, that means that they have enough variability over the random slope. But if I go over and use information out of the weighted least estimates, instead of having only like 4 or 5 countries, I get like double. So what is happening is that given the properties that the weighted least estimate have, I have more chances to get a different estimate of the variance of the random slope. So with this kind of information, it's kind of like I can claim that I have enough variability over the random slope for more countries than that I could do with the previous method. So just to give you an overview, So in the first one, I get only for like 17%, and the other one is for like 30%. And if I do the same thing for the socioeconomic gaps, I get more or less the same thing. So I have like a few bubbles here. If I go and use the weighted least estimate, I have way much more bubbles around blue. And our claim is that the main issue, I mean, this is not an issue of if there is variability or not across the classroom. This is an issue of, this is a limitation of the scores that we're using in each round. So when we're using plausible values, we get less. When we use the weighted least estimate, we get more. And we get the same kind of thing. So, just as a summary, if by any chance you need to do some sort of a research inquiry in which you need to have these elements, so you need to retrieve an estimation out of random slopes, I would say, or I would defend that a better tool to get that kind of estimate is the weighted least estimates instead of the plausible values. If you're really concerned about the representation of the measurement error, there are other ways to do it. You can try to fix or do a trick with the observed weighted least estimate and put there the variability that you're expecting to. So this is kind of like, you're allowed to not ignore the measurement error if you want to. But if because you want to go to let's say to protect the idea that your estimates are above the measurement error, if you want to address questions of random loss, of random slopes, this protection of the measurement errors is going to come at a cost. It's going to eat up the variance that you're looking for. So I would recommend not to use plausible values for certain questions, not for all the questions, but for certain questions. So as a take-home message for secondary users, so if you're really in this specific niche or the need to estimate random slope, it seems to be that the weighted least estimates is a better tool to do it instead of using the plausible values. And for ILSA providers, I'm talking here as an ILSA provider as well. Like I need to defend the idea that we might need to include the IRT weighted least estimates because they do have a use for secondary users. When you don't put them in the public database, that means that if a secondary user wants to do something as such, they would need to generate the IRT weighted least estimate for themselves, and that's going to be like a lot of time of estimation. So, by all means, if you're, let's say, you're putting out there like some sort of representation of the ability of interest, I would say that it is in the best interest of everyone to have as many tools as possible for so other users can address the substantive questions that they need. If you're only reducing the plausible values, that means that you're limiting the kind of research inquiries that the secondary users could do.